Welcome to the Hillsdale College Online Courses Podcast. I'm Jeremiah Regan.
And I'm Juan, and we're back with our course, The History of Classical Music, Pythagoras through Beethoven. We're on to lecture number 2 today, the Baroque Era, Bach, Handel, and Vivaldi.
Joining us again is Hillsdale College Online Courses Operations Fellow and concert violinist Michael Eller. Good to have you again, Michael.
Good to be here.
This era of music, this is actually one of my favorites. I think Vivaldi is one of my favorite composers, and Handel produced The Messiah, which is probably one of my favorite pieces of music.
This is a great lecture. The first is captivating, and we learn a lot about history, but by lecture 2, we are now into the music, fully deep. So Professor Knight raises the point that Vivaldi was the champion of the solo concerto. Michael, what is a solo concerto, and what was unique about Vivaldi?
So before Vivaldi, you had concertos, but before they were normally for an ensemble, and the point of the piece was to put on display the abilities of the players within the ensemble and to just basically show off.
So it's truly a group performance.
Yes, that's before Vivaldi. What Vivaldi did is that he decided to start writing concertos for solo players, and so in this form, you'd have the soloist standing or sitting in front of the rest of the ensemble, and the spotlight would be on the soloist, and they would pull off these very amazing technical achievements and wow the audience. So it was a revolutionary development.
And I think, at least, when I think Vivaldi, I think of his violin concertos and the Four Seasons. Is that an example of solo concertos?
Yes, very much so.
Yeah, and I think anybody, if you don't have in mind what it is, you'll hear about it you'll hear the pieces of music in the lecture, and you'll immediately recognize those violin concertos because they're absolutely beautiful.
Professor Knight taught me something that I didn't know, and we actually have these posted on our website, but Vivaldi wrote a sonnet for each of the seasons in the Four Seasons. We have those translated and available on the online courses website. You can check them out. Now, Juan, I know you're a big admirer of Handel, and you even have a story about him.
Well, Handel was really I had obviously been introduced to classical music before. My parents always took us growing up to concerts and things like that. But I had heard of the Hallelujah chorus, of course, who hasn't? But I didn't know that it was part of a bigger piece of music. And in my undergrad, they did The Messiah every year. And once I saw just people lining up to go somewhere, and I had no idea what it was. And I went to ask, and they said, "Oh, there's going to be a concert." I was like, "Well, I'll sneak in. Is there any extra tickets?" And they're, "Sure, go ahead, go in." And I remember I can picture the room. I sat in, I saw the choir, and I sat down and I started listening to this incredible piece of music. And I had never heard or seen such a beautiful thing that for me, it brought everything together, because the story is obviously about Jesus, about the Messiah, the coming of him, and it brings that story together with beautiful pieces of music with all 4 harmonies coming together. It's quite incredible. And so since then, Handel has been one of my favorites.
Professor Knight brings out that many of these classical composers, including Bach, were motivated to write their music by their deep religious faith. They saw these pieces of art as expressions of their love for their creator, their appreciation for their creator, and they accomplished things with music that had never been done before. Michael, what makes Bach, who's known for his fugues, unique?
Bach is one of those things that's almost like trying to explain away God, where he's so just set above every other composer. It's hard to even explain why, but you just know that it's something special just in hearing it.
What's your favorite piece of music from Bach?
Definitely the Chaconne in D minor from the second violin partita.
Why?
It was written sort of as a memoriam to his wife who had just passed, and he didn't find out. I think I might be wrong about this, but I don't think he found out about her death until 3 weeks after it happened, because everything was by written letter back then. And so he wrote the Chaconne, and it's just 15 minutes of a single violin, and that piece of music is able to draw out some very incredible emotions.
You said it's Bach. What's the name of it again?
The Chaconne in D minor from the second violin partita.
When we're done here, I'm going to need to listen to that.
If you're liking the course, we have a DVD available of the course. If you go to hillsdale.edu/course and donate $100 to support this course and all of our online courses so we can make them available to more people, we will send you a copy of that DVD. Again, that's hillsdale.edu/course. And now let's turn to Dr. Hyperion Knight in Lecture 2 of the History of Classical Music, the Baroque Era, Bach, Handel, and Vivaldi.
The Baroque era in music was spiritual heir to the High Renaissance. But even though we now take this deluge of musical genius for granted, with Bach, Scarlatti, and Handel all born in the same year, it took a nearly miraculous combination of events to make it all possible. To begin with, the fall of Constantinople to the Ottomans in 1453 was a disaster that spelled the end of the Byzantine Empire, but it provided an unexpected windfall for the nascent Italian Renaissance as Byzantine scholars fled to the West and shared their knowledge of Greek language and literature. It wasn't long before the highest standards in both art and literature were reborn, founded on Greek and Roman ideals. But while the Medici family in Florence may indeed have revived a golden age, and how could it be otherwise, with the young Michelangelo under the wing of Lorenzo Medici the Magnificent, it wasn't until the High Renaissance that the tastemakers in Europe elevated music to the same exalted level. At last, after centuries of debate, a compromise was finally within reach for the best possible method of tuning the 7 white notes and the 5 black notes of what we call the chromatic scale, enabling the new tonal system of 24 major and minor keys to replace the modal system of medieval church modes. The Renaissance men of Florence, working with Vincenzo Galilei, the father of Galileo, had figured out that the appeal of ancient Greek theater was not just with the words, it was with the fact that the words were also sung. And so they invented opera. And with opera, plays that were sung, the exuberant, magnificent, grandiose style of the Baroque was born. The first Baroque masterpiece appeared in 1607, an Italian opera by Claudio Monteverdi set to the story of Orpheus, the ancient Greek poet who could charm any living creature with his music. And with Monteverdi's opera L'Orfeo, the curtain opens on the Baroque era. Along with his operas, Monteverdi's vocal works include religious gems like his Sacred Vespers, and he could pack just as much Baroque operatic drama into his sacred music. Monteverdi was also famous for his madrigals, whose name implies the mother tongue, Italian, which was now replacing Latin as the language of choice, particularly in this new secular art form called opera, which was a true feast for the senses, combining music with drama, dance, and scenery. And unfortunately for Florence and the Medici family's hopes of prolonging their artistic reign after birthing the Renaissance, the natural home for such a sensual new art form was their artistic rival Venice, famous for its life of pleasure. Monteverdi decamped to Venice, where he tutored a composer named Cavalli, who wrote a smash hit opera about Jason and the Argonauts capturing the Golden Fleece, and before long, Venice had an opera season that rivaled Carnival in popularity. Venice now delivered the coup de grace to Florence and became the hotspot for Italian music in the Baroque. And as if the invention of opera wasn't enough, the Italian Baroque was even more remarkable in the realm of instrumental music. The luthiers in Cremona, who made string instruments without equal, became household names. Today, a Stradivarius violin will set you back several $1,000,000. At any rate, the string family of instruments was crucial to the growth of the orchestra. The violin, or violino in Italian, means little viola. The violin is smaller and plays higher notes than the viola. The cello, or violoncello, means little double bass. The cello plays the bass notes, and the double bass doubles the bass notes an octave below. The growth of the orchestra was spurred by Arcangelo Corelli, who was also one of the first violin virtuosos, the soloists who could dazzle all on their own. And Corelli called his works for orchestra concerti grossi, meaning concerts with a big group of players. Arcangelo Corelli was also the archangel of tonality, the first composer to use tonality, the new tonal system, to full effect, as you can hear in his Christmas concerto. This emerging musical form called the concerto was about to get its greatest early champion in Venice's own Antonio Vivaldi, who perfected the concerto idiom as we know it today, a work for orchestra with a soloist out front leading the charge, usually in 3 movements, fast, slow, fast. In Baroque concertos, the 2 outer movements are usually in ritornello form, meaning that the orchestra keeps returning with a ritornello theme, while in between, the soloist or soloists would dazzle with their virtuosity in different kinds of episodes. It's hard to grasp the genius of Vivaldi. He wrote literally hundreds of concertos, and in between, for spare cash, somewhere between 50 to 100 operas. And his concertos weren't just for violin. Even his concerto for guitar is irresistible. And somehow, Vivaldi wrote all this music while holding down a day job. He was actually ordained as a priest, but he was such an impressive violin virtuoso that he was drafted to teach music at an orphanage, the Hospital of Mercy, where the most talented young ladies actually formed an all-female orchestra that Vivaldi conducted. He then went on to compose some of the biggest hits of all time. Vivaldi and the Four Seasons were even bigger than Frankie Valli and the Four Seasons. And Vivaldi's 4 most famous concertos also broke new ground. They were program music, non-vocal music that still actually tells a story. And Vivaldi was gracious enough to also write 4 sonnets, 4 poems that tell us exactly what's happening in the music. Vivaldi begins his sonnets by announcing, "Springtime is upon us." His sonnet continues, "The birds celebrate spring's return with festive song." After spring, the second of the 4 seasons is naturally summer, and Vivaldi's sonnet warns of a hard season fired by the sun. Then we hear the cuckoo's voice. And then sweet songs of the turtle dove and finch are heard. But then the north wind appears, threatening thunderbolts and lightning. In the 3rd movement, Presto Finale, the shepherd's fears are justified, and Vivaldi writes that lightning makes the heavens thunder and roar. The violin was king in the Italian Baroque, but another instrument was nipping at its heels. What was that other instrument? Well, it's hard to say exactly. You see, the Baroque era saw the transition from the harpsichord to the piano, with at least one intermediary instrument in between. But composers rarely specified which of these instruments they were actually writing for. We gloss over this rather embarrassing situation by referring to pieces for clavier or keyboard. But lurking beneath this confusion is a story of triumph. The harpsichord was literally a harp laid flat in a case so that the harp's chords, or strings, could be hit by a key rather than plucked by a harpist. It's a wonderful instrument, but it lacked one thing: the ability to go from soft to loud, which in Italian is from piano to forte. Instrument makers hit upon the idea of striking the string rather than plucking it. And that way, how hard you strike the key determines how loud the note is. But the intermediary instrument, the clavichord, had its own problem. If you struck the string, the metal tangent stayed there until you released the key. So as a result, even though it should have been able to play soft and loud, it was actually just soft all the time because the tangent was muting the string. The problem was finally solved in 1700 by the ingenious inventor Bartolomeo Cristofori, who invented what we call an escapement, which allowed a wooden hammer to strike the string and then instantly rebound, allowing the action to continue. This allowed the piano to be both soft, piano, and loud, and he called his new instrument the pianoforte. And his incredibly intricate design meant that every time you strike a key on a piano, it sets 100 moving parts in motion, and a modern piano contains over 10,000 moving parts. And that's how it's able to create sounds like this.
Hillsdale College is a small, Christian, classical liberal arts college that operates independently of government funding, and we want you or your son or daughter to apply. At Hillsdale, students grow in heart and mind by studying timeless truths in a supportive community dedicated to the highest things. Hillsdale College costs significantly less than other nationally ranked private liberal arts colleges and receives regular recognition as a best value, and nearly all students receive financial aid. Our robust core curriculum, vibrant student life, and 8-to-1 student-to-faculty ratio make for an education like no other. For more information or to fill out an application, visit hillsdale.edu/info. That's hillsdale.edu/info.
Ironically, it was one of Italy's greatest Baroque opera composers, Alessandro Scarlatti, who was the father of its great keyboard music, both figuratively and literally. First, figuratively, by designing the da capo aria for the serious opera style of the day, opera seria, and then literally by fathering a son named Domenico Scarlatti, who would go on to write over 500 keyboard sonatas. Now, the word sonata just means sounded, played on an instrument, as opposed to cantata, which means sung. But sonata went on to have two very different and equally important meanings. The one we encounter most often is an arrangement of several movements, usually 3 or 4, constituting a larger work. Over time, this came to mean sonatas for solo instruments, but the larger movement structure also applies to orchestral works like symphonies. The second meaning relates to the shape or form of each individual movement. And for this, we can thank the Scarlatti family capo, Alessandro, because his da capo aria was in 3 parts. First, a song, and then a little middle section in a different key, and then you take it from the top, or head, da capo, and play the first section again in the original key. His son Domenico Scarlatti then transformed this da capo aria form into what we now call sonata form, with an exposition, a development, and then a recapitulation with the theme from the exposition returning, recapitulated, in the original key. This basic ABA structure would influence most movements in classical music for the next 200 years. But Alessandro's son Domenico Scarlatti wouldn't write most of his 555 sonatas in Italy. He was in demand by the royal courts of Portugal and Spain, and he spent most of his life on the Iberian Peninsula, marvelously fusing local sounds with sonata form. He could even make a harpsichord sound like hunting horns. Or he could give us a royal fanfare at court. He might use repeated notes to imitate the sound of a Spanish guitar. Or take us to a courtly dance using modal harmonies from Iberian folk music. Or he might just allow the performers to have fun, showing off by crossing their hands. Scarlatti's own skills as a player must have been remarkable for him to be in such demand. It's said that he was even in a contest with the German composer Handel, and Scarlatti was judged superior at the harpsichord. But Handel was deemed to be better at the organ, and that might explain why he wrote a lot of organ concertos later in life. But before that, destiny had other things in store for the great George Friedrich Handel. As it happens, the Medici family had not given up yet on their hope of making Florence Italy's musical capital. So knowing of the genius of this young German composer, they invited Handel to Italy, hoping that he might be lured into writing Italian operas. The fashion of the day was called opera seria, serious music dramas that used librettos, the little books with the words, that were based on history or ancient mythology. And Handel took the bait. He started working with Italian librettists, writing opera seria. But sadly for Florence, he decided not to remain in Italy. He chose instead to move to London, where he became an overnight sensation with his opera Rinaldo. Handel could now be described as a German composer writing Italian operas in Great Britain. And he became a darling of the British royal family. King George I even asked him to write water music to be performed on the River Thames. And when it came time to pass the royal scepter to George's son, Handel wrote Zadok the Priest for the crowning of George II, which is now the coronation anthem used to celebrate the anointing of all British monarchs. In 1728, a satirical work appeared on the London stage called The Beggar's Opera, and it was a shot across the bow. It made fun of the pretensions of opera seria, and it spelled the end of opera seria and Italian opera in general in England. Not only was the style starting to feel dated, but let's face it, the English public was getting tired of concerts with the entire music in a foreign language. So English language oratorios suddenly gained the favor of the public, and Handel was only too happy to oblige. At this stage in his life, he may have been happy to write oratorios that weren't just entertainment, but could also reflect his deeply held religious faith, a faith that was also extremely important to the British middle class that attended his concerts. Handel's genuine humanitarianism is on display as he prepared to produce his masterpiece, Messiah. Instead of premiering the work in London, he decided to take it to Ireland, and in Dublin, he arranged a series of concerts for charitable benefits, specifically buying convicts out of debtors' prison. What a gift it was to humanity when Messiah premiered in 1742, and not only did mankind receive its most popular oratorio, but hundreds of souls were freed from prison and from their debt. By tradition, at the beginning of the Hallelujah chorus, we in the audience rise to our feet, as well we should. And let there be no doubt, his Messiah was music and text meant to share with the audience what Handel himself considered most important in life. Until the end of his life, Messiah performances were staged to fund hospitals, orphanages, and other charities. Sadly, in his last years, the infirmity of old age took a serious toll on Handel, but he died a wealthy and beloved public figure, and quite deservedly so. Well done, sir. It's one of the curiosities of music history that Handel's fame so greatly outshined that of his contemporary J.S. Bach, who was actually born the same year as him, 1685. There has never been a musician more talented than Johann Sebastian Bach, and for that we can probably thank his genetics. The Bach family dynasty had already produced several generations of musicians, so many in fact that the name Bach was already becoming synonymous with musician itself. And Bach himself would also be the father of several composers of great distinction. Tragically, he became an orphan at age 10, and having lost his parents, he went to live with his eldest brother, Johann Christoph Bach, who was an organist who had studied with Johann Pachelbel. Johann Christoph Bach was absolutely happy to mentor his eager younger brother, but young Johann Sebastian Bach was so eager to learn everything he could that he would disobediently stay up all night copying scores. And copying other composers' scores was his gateway to the entire galaxy of music, so that he could stay in touch with all the musical styles of the day. But, as it happened, challenging authority also became a lifelong habit for Bach in a career full of ups and downs. And he was not only born into a musical environment, but also a profoundly religious one. His hometown of Eisenach had been central to the early life of Martin Luther 200 years earlier, as Luther translated the Bible into the German vernacular and created a whole new body of church music. For Bach personally, his devout Lutheranism defined him every bit as much as his musical existence. His perpetual motion chorale, Jesu, Joy of Man's Desiring, leaves no doubt about his own personal desires. Despite his pious nature, or maybe because of it, his life was marked by tension with the authorities. In Arnstadt, he was accused of confusing the singers with his complex harmonies, and he was even forced to draw his dagger in defense when he was attacked by a second-rate bassoonist. He was put on trial, and the court told him he needed to become more tolerant of other people's imperfections. In Weimar, he was even thrown in jail for trying to quit his job. But he did find a few years of real happiness working for a music-loving prince in Anhalt-Köthen. It was here that he wrote many of his groundbreaking instrumental works. These included his orchestral suites, the first book of his well-tempered clavier with preludes and fugues in all 24 keys, his sonatas for solo violin that included fugues that made a single fiddle sound like a whole orchestra, and his cello suites that achieved a miracle of variety and expression, but just using the one solo cello without any accompaniment. And if evidence of his happiness were required, I can think of no more joyful outburst than his Brandenburg concertos, named for their recipient, the Margrave of Brandenburg. Each of the 6 concertos is unique in music history. Every one of them is scored for a combination of instruments that was never used before and never used since. The 5th Brandenburg, for instance, is the only one with a harpsichord solo. But behind all this exuberance was a darker reality. His first wife, Maria Barbara, had died suddenly. He later remarried fellow musician Anna Magdalena, who proved to be a valuable helpmate. But of the 20 children Bach fathered, only 10 survived to adulthood. Bach himself started to question whether happiness wasn't an indulgence when he wrote, "Do our smiles mock the dead?" When his position at Köthen soured, Bach moved to Leipzig, where he became director of church music and produced a vast body of religious masterpieces. For many people, Bach became the 5th evangelist, as for years he produced a new cantata for church services almost every week and wrote his Passion oratorios about the life of Christ. In his St. Matthew Passion, Bach asks of his heart to make itself pure. But in this period, he also wrote his Goldberg variations and the art of the fugue, his monuments to counterpoint, the craft of his composition. Counterpoint is different musical lines acting independently, but often in direct imitation. In his Goldbergs, Bach uses the most direct form of counterpoint, the most straightforward form of imitation, the canon. And famous examples of canons are rounds like Row, Row, Row Your Boat, or Frere Jacques, or a famous canon in D, a top 10 hit by Pachelbel. Bach also utilized this technique in his 2-part inventions, like the famous one in D minor, as well as the one in F major. But the pinnacle of Bach's counterpoint is the fugue. And in fugal counterpoint, the fugue subject is a fugitive that takes flight from the strict rules of the canon, because the voices now enter at different pitches. In his little fugue in G minor, we hear the opening subject begin, naturally, on G. And then the second voice comes in on D. And then the next voice enters on G again. This supreme form of counterpoint allowed Bach to embrace all of human existence in his music. Bach was greatly admired by many during his lifetime, as witnessed when Frederick the Great of Prussia invited him to Sanssouci Palace to improvise on his new forte pianos. Bach wrote the musical Offering in Frederick's honor, including a fugue in 6 voices. But inexcusably, it would be almost a century before the world recognized the miracle in its midst. This was partly because the contrapuntal style had already fallen out of fashion. Even before the end of Bach's life, a new lighter Rococo style had emerged. In fact, 2 of Bach's own sons, C.P.E. Bach and Johann Christian Bach, were to be leading composers in this new Rococo era. But none of this changes the fact that, as Robert Schumann would say, music owes as much to Bach as religion to its founder. The dawning age of enlightenment would herald great advances in science, along with new ideals in arts and politics based on classical forms. But the new emerging classical period would have a very tall order indeed to match the musical achievements of the Baroque.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Hillsdale College Online Courses podcast. If you want to continue learning about classical education or other topics, please visit hillsdale.edu/course. There you will find over 40 free online courses, including Constitution 101, The Real American Founding, American Citizenship and Its Decline, and many more. The courses include additional readings, study guides, fully produced videos, and you can chat with your fellow students on a dedicated forum. Upon completing a course, you will also get a certificate. All our courses are free because we believe that a virtuous citizen is the best defense for liberty. So pursue the education necessary for freedom and happiness at hillsdale.edu/course today. That's hillsdale.edu/course. Thanks for listening.